I'm going to pass straight over then to Sue and Emily. They're presenting a paper on international approaches to virtual parliaments. So over to you guys.
Great, thank you very much. My name's Sue Griffiths. I was until late last year Director of Global Partners Governance, since handed over that to my colleague Emily, and we're going to split this presentation between us. For those of you who don't know, Global Partners is an organisation that works internationally, but also in the UK with parliaments to support them in discharging their functions. We have a focus on developing democracies, but as I said, not exclusively. And the last year has been quite challenging for anyone who works internationally because you can't physically go to any of the countries that you work in, but there's been really quite a high degree of interest among parliaments, first of all, in going online at all, and secondly, in sharing experience between what others have been doing. This presentation draws particularly on two pieces of work, but also on our experience generally. One of them was done with the Asia Foundation, and particularly with the Parliament of Mongolia, who at a very early stage in the pandemic, and I'm talking kind of May, June last year, were really keen to be able to go online and have a functioning virtual parliament, and keen to learn how to do that. And that entails some research at that point about what was happening elsewhere. And we've also been able to be involved through the Study of Parliament group on a bit more of a considered months later look back at parliaments and the pandemic. They have published last week a collection of articles on that subject. I think it's called Parliaments in the Pandemic. And it largely focuses on UK parliaments, but we've contributed an article there, which is an international survey. And anytime you're talking about international surveys, I would add a note of caution at the beginning that, of course, every parliament is different. There are trends, but there are always counterexamples. There are, each parliament deserves to be studied in its own right. But having said that, I'm nevertheless going to plough ahead and just pick out three broad trends that we have observed from our work, and then hand over after that to Emily to say a bit more about the meat and the detail of how that has happened. So firstly, I would say that the pandemic obviously forced parliaments to do things they had previously put in a too hard box or kicked down the road repeatedly, both digitally and procedurally. And obviously those two things are linked together. And I think it's notable that faced with a situation where there was an option of doing nothing or suspending or going into a recess or going with an imperfect digital solution, the vast majority decided to go with the imperfect solution and accept that it might not work perfectly. So there were very few parliaments initially that decided not to sit. I think Hungary and Australia are some examples from the beginning, and even there that's been reconsidered as time has passed and it's become clear that a crisis that we maybe initially thought would only last for months is going on to months and years potentially. So you look at things, examples like committees working online, but particularly also more controversial things like proxy voting, which in many parliaments has been considered not something to dive into. The bullet was bitten quite quickly in many cases. The second point is that, particularly at the beginning, parliaments had to really prioritise what they thought were the most important functions to carry on virtually. And that, generally speaking, didn't extend to the whole of their functions. So things like enabling technological solutions for remote voting are quite tricky. And where possible, parliaments decided to try and avoid the need for decisions by vote by coming up with other forms of scrutiny. There was found to be a need to be looking at the emergency legislation that many governments were taking in response to the pandemic. So something had to be put in place immediately, but prioritisation meant that corners were cut in certain circumstances. And I think the interesting thing coming out of that is that what's important in an initial crisis is not necessarily what's important in the longer term. So as time has passed, that initial response, it's not really fit for purpose anymore. There's legislation coming through in most countries that has nothing to do with COVID. It's business as usual. How do you fit that in a virtual world? So it will be interesting to see how the initial virtual response is modified as time goes on. And then the last general point that I'll make before handing over to Emily is that pretty much everywhere, and I'm sure we'll recognise this from our professional experiences as well, it's easier for smaller groups to go virtual than big groups. So we can see this in most countries. Committees went online fairly seamlessly because we're talking about, maybe a dozen people in a room. Whereas larger parliaments, where we're talking hundreds of people, maybe 300, 400 more, found it much harder to have that interaction. And we see this as well with the smaller parliaments and the larger parliaments. So the interesting question there is, if you're restricting your parliamentary proceedings to a smaller group, how do you select that group? Do you allow the party leaders to select it? Do you have some other categories or criteria that you're going to apply? And does that then lead to any kind of two-tier system, certain people being present in person, others dialing in remotely, that maybe perpetuates or creates new inequalities? I have, since leaving GPG, moved to an organisation that focuses on gender equality. And there's been quite a few interesting studies of whether women MPs, for example, contribute more or less if they're working in a virtual parliament. And so far, the quantitative figures suggest that actually there isn't a huge difference in the levels of contributions people are making. But the question that follows from that is there a qualitative difference? Are you disadvantaged if you're not there in person? Either because you're female or older or have a health condition? And that's something that will take time to judge, but an interesting one to watch. And at that point, I'll hand over to Emily.
Thank you very much, Sue. Can everyone hear me okay? Yes, super. Thank you. Right before this session, my internet connection went down and they started drilling in the wall next door. So if there's a slight frisson of panic during any of my remarks, do please excuse me. But I think that's a very appropriate state for the subject we're currently discussing. So just to introduce myself, my name is Emily Death, and as Sue mentioned, I'm now, following from her, the Director of GPG, Global Partners Governance. And just one other point about GPG, some of you may have seen, but if not, I would commend to you our Parliamentary Response to Crisis blog series, which is available on our website, gpgovernance.net. And as the pandemic hit, we were able to amass quite a range of different approaches from the UK and internationally about how parliaments were dealing with the situation in which they found themselves. And that gives a lot more detail than we will be able to cover today. As Sue mentioned, I co-authored with her our piece, which we submitted to the Study of Parliament group collection, Parliaments in a Time of Pandemic. My contribution particularly focused on case studies, the Maldives and Bahrain in particular, also New Zealand and some others, in the context of their adaptations to remote and virtual work during the COVID-19 pandemic. Again, I'll make three key points, particularly referencing some of those examples that came out of the case studies. The pandemic did actually provide an opportunity for parliaments to have a technological rethink. And we saw that it was certainly those who had already done significant work to make their IT-supported parliamentary processes fit for modern purpose as part of ongoing developments, who were the best placed to deal with the pandemic when it hit. So those who'd already grasped the nettle on those issues, which, as Sue described, the sort of too hard issues of digital transformation, were much better placed. So this was the case in the Maldives, which became the first parliament to hold a virtual session during the pandemic on the 30th of March 2020. But they already had Microsoft collaborative technologies in place from 2019. And they did even manage to use a remote voting service, as Sue mentioned as well, one of those more difficult categories of remote facilities called Polly. And although, of course, they saw connection challenges, as everyone else did, rolling that out was quite significant. To link also to one of Sue's earlier points, remote adaptation was always easier for smaller groups. We saw that across the board. And in the example there given of the Maldives and also Bahrain, that I'll talk a little more about later, we are talking about much smaller parliaments than Westminster, of course, with 87 and 40 members of their lower house apiece. We have seen that parliaments need to be as future focused as other businesses. Otherwise, there is a risk, I think, in the coming years that time will be spent on building infrastructure to deal with the last challenge of the pandemic, rather than looking ahead towards what the next one may be and preparing for that. So secondly, we saw that technological developments, which, in many cases have been miraculous, have had to go hand in hand with cultural and mindset shifts amongst the people working in the parliaments, that's the staff and the MPs, also as well as the public. So this is to ensure the need for them is clear, and when you might be saying that an extra budget is needed for MPs to get their staffs to have the right technical equipment, you need to take people alongside with you on that. To make sure they become successful in the longer term and they lead to further sensible developments. So these are actually massive organisational change programmes, which in several cases just landed on parliaments, as they did to all other organisations in March last year when the pandemic hit. And whereas ordinarily this would have been something that was part of a really long-term strategic plan, which included skills building, training, maybe on-hand technical support in the shorter and longer term, it was something that happened all of a sudden. And where these two things have been managed successfully in tandem, that's digital transformation with support to behaviour change, they've actually had a significant impact on the behaviour of Parliament members. And I'll give the example of the Bahraini Parliament and its lower house, the Majlis al-Nuab, who described to us very clearly the complete lack of a culture of work from home and facilities for it at the beginning of the pandemic. So they had to make the same tricky adaptations to remote and virtual procedures as other parliaments did, or as other parliaments chose to do. But they also used this as an opportunity to emphasise various interesting things. For example, the programme of their Parliamentary Training and Studies Centre. They held 12 training sessions for MPs during the first lockdown, as well as more than 97 training sessions for staff of the Parliamentary Secretariat and in MPs' offices. The opportunity was also taken to involve a wider pool of trainers, including international experts, in these remote sessions, which they were able to do. And the training programmes were received very positively by members and staff, and interestingly saw a much greater level of participation than at pre-COVID training sessions. So there's various possible explanations for this, partly perhaps as a result of MPs simply being more available for these kind of trainings. They just needed to dial in at home or maybe from their constituency rather than be there in Parliament physically on a specific day and at a particular time to engage with the training. Partly, of course, there was a genuine realisation of need to engage with the trainings, particularly those around digital skills needed to take part in the new virtual Parliament setup. But this then paved the way for broader participation in training across the board and also beyond the pandemic. And then the third point, the pandemic may actually have allowed parliaments to connect with less traditional and wider and younger audiences. So this is about parliamentary engagement. As a result of the necessity to find different ways of communicating online through social media, for example, we've seen some very interesting ones of those already today. In Bahrain, there's a very direct communication on social media, chiefly Instagram, between Parliament and people who can directly take part in various activities, several of which were dedicated ones which the Parliament rolled out during the pandemic, competitions, surveys, different activities on social media. The Parliament also broadcast lots and lots, a huge amount of videos and interviews and live streams parliamentary plenary sittings weekly on YouTube, which was a key way of keeping people involved or in the loop during the pandemic. Additionally to that, I've also heard several instances of parliamentarians from a wide variety of different countries praising the ability to call a more diverse range of witnesses to committee inquiries, for example, through being able to do so remotely. So I think we need to, by way of conclusion, think about how to capture this for some of the longer term. And as Sue mentioned, may there be a natural backsliding? Once there's a vaccine, will things sort of snap back to pre-pandemic? Or, which might be the ideal scenario, will parliaments prove themselves able to capture the best of what they had previously and what worked when they were obliged to reimagine? And with that, I conclude the remarks on our paper and we'll be very glad to take further questions.